Thank you for today's inviting me to today's presentation. It's very interesting to share something I had done about 15 years ago when I was a master's student. This research had been published in Turkish as a book, but I could not have the possibility to share it in different conferences. And today it's for the first time that I do it in English. So women and fashion in occupied Istanbul. Why occupation years are so important for Ottoman women's fashion? Maybe for understanding this, one should know the political developments of the period. As we all know, during the armistice period, social life in Istanbul was shaped by not only the occupying forces, but as Timur had told us, the Russian refugees as well. And those people living in the city now were introducing new entertainment styles, fashions, and their new cultural patterns as well between 1918 and 23, which was long 5 years that shaped also women's entertainment styles and fashion. So during Istanbul's occupation, we can say that there was a political vacuum in the city. The Sultan's sovereignty was very much limited by the Allied forces. And after the Armistice of Mudros was signed on October 13, 1918, also the political power of the Committee of Union and Progress diminished and soon ended. On November 4, 1916, the Ottoman Parliament was dissolved and Istanbul was occupied by Allied ships on November 13, 1918. Afterwards, we can say that many political developments had also happened in the city, but all of these influenced women as well, especially the occupation of Izmir in May 15, 1919. Many educated Muslim women like Halide Edip, Nakiye Hanım, or Münevver Hanım became speakers in public meetings in front of thousands of people, which was a very new development at that time. Soon, as a result of the national struggle, there were many women who were seen as soldiers, as speakers, as even spies in the city. At the end of the national struggle and the Lausanne Treaty, the occupation of Istanbul also ended before the Lausanne Treaty at October 6, 1923. And with the evacuation of the city and the arrival of the Turkish army, now this power vacuum that women used a lot to shape their fashions ended. This was a period, 5 years period, that they could bend the rules of fashion, a lot of rules of fashion they had to abide before. And for understanding this development, I used the women's magazines of the time, like as you can see in my PowerPoint, Türk Kadını, which has a very similar front page, cover page to the Saturday evening, and İnci, Yeni İnci, Resimli Ay, and Süs, which are very similar fashion magazines, women's magazines. So I cannot say that fashion was the most important thing during the occupation years, because war had shaped the lives of people a lot. Many people were suffering from hunger, many people were suffering from poverty, and these economic difficulties. This crisis was also seen as a challenge, but at the same time, it was for the advantage of certain people like the war profiteers who had made fortunes using the economic crisis. Their daughters, their wives, their mistresses all became fashionistas, like the influencers of today. They were spending extravagantly for fashion items at that time. So the European fashions entered in a much faster, more rapidly in these 5 years. And this is also satirized in the press of the time, in the literature of the time. So the center of this development is Beyoğlu, the Pera Street, and you can see a picture of Pera during the armistice period. These pictures are taken by the French army and you can find them all in a book by the French army, taken by the photographers of the French army. So during these years, the change was rapid, but we cannot say that this change was new. You can say that in the 18th century and as well as the 18th century, in the 19th century, there were a trend for the modernization of Ottoman clothing, which started first in the army, but then women also got their share from this change. Shortly, and especially the 19th century, people were consuming mass fashions, fashion items of Europe. And even though, for example, Sultan Selim III were forbidding feraces of different colors, you can here see the ferace, if you can see, of course, if there is no problem with my PowerPoint. Women in Istanbul wore ferace in different colors than what was allowed. For instance, they were trying to bend, even at that time, the decrees of the Sultan. For instance, Muslim women had to wear these feraces, which were sewn from wool in winter and silk in summer with a white satin lining. Muslim women had to wear yellow leather shoes, and they had to cover their faces with a veil called yashmak. And they can wear green, yellow, or blue and green, blue and red feraces, while the non-Muslim women had to wear more pale colors, and they were not allowed to wear, for instance, yellow shoes. But then, even though there were certain limits, women tried to bend them a lot, and they wore more colorful feraces even at that time. And the new fashions were mainly introduced by Greek tailors called modistra at that time. These women, Greek women, could also come to the houses of the Muslim middle class or high class women. So they introduced European fashions with certain limits, because it was not possible for Muslim women to show off on the street as other non-Muslim Ottoman subjects. So they had to, for instance, hide their fashionable clothing in their ferace, and they could show these only at home or indoors. But modistras shaped some parts of these European clothing, and therefore Muslim Ottoman women as well could follow Paris fashions as a result. And at the same time, there were large fashion companies who had their own labels. These foreign tailors also served for wealthy families at that time. And mainly these two institutions adopted the European fashions, and there were very much similarity between the European fashion and Ottoman fashion. For instance, when the transition from Empire style to Art Nouveau style appeared, at that time, Ottoman women chose not to wear ferace, which was more Empire style, but they chose to wear their çarşaf. So this transition was in parallel with what happened in Europe. But now when çarşaf started to appear on the street, just like the ferace in unallowed colors, for instance, çarşaf was also forbidden by Sultan Abdülhamit II, who feared certain political dangers of the çarşaf, because it was covering the faces of women much more, and maybe his male enemies could wear çarşaf and therefore hide themselves. This was a threat for the Sultan. And Istanbul police for 2 years cut the skirts of the çarşafs as a result of the decree of the Sultan. But even though there were certain limitations, Istanbul women continued to wear çarşaf until 1908, when the second constitution happened. The second constitutional era started. With the second constitution, of course, women felt more encouraged to wear narrower çarşafs. They could use coats just like the fur coats of European women, and their veils became more transparent. For example, in this slide, you can see a woman not wearing at all a veil, and the other one on the left side is wearing a very thin veil. So women were showing off much more on the street, and some of them only hid their faces with umbrellas rather than veils. And we can say that the çarşafs were becoming narrower, so the bodies of women were more visible on the street. Inside these çarşafs, women preferred to use the coats, European style coats, and sometimes they throw the veil to a side, and when they needed, they used it back. And under the clothes they use, you can see fashionable coats and dresses of wealthy women who could, as I explained, only show these things indoors. So gradually the cloaks also became less and less, and they tucked these clothes into the mantles, and after a while they too disappeared. The part of the cloak that covered the head was replaced by a smaller piece of cloth, and the veil was thrown towards the back of the head like an accessory, and the nape also was exposed. During the armistice, things changed rapidly, as I explained, and we can say the Russian refugees influenced Istanbul fashions a lot, deeply. When the Bolshevik Revolution happened in 1917, approximately 200,000 Russians escaped civil war and arrived Istanbul. Only Istanbul and Serbia were expecting them in masses, in large numbers. So at that time. And among these people were Russians from aristocratic families, elite Russians, white Russian army members, and Russians from many different professions and classes. Among them were, of course, wealthy Russian families, and these people, some of them coming from the Romanov family, the wealthy merchants, of course, they sold jewelry and fur in Istanbul to survive in the city. So as a result of it, rich women in Istanbul started using fur more frequently. They had a keen interest in fur, although the climate was warmer than in Russia. As a result, Russian immigrants, like they did in other cultural areas, opened clothing shops, and in La Grande Rue du Pera, which is the former name of Beyoğlu. The fur shop of Turchikin from Moscow, serving at 105 Paris Street, the saloon of Kaminsky and Schulman from Odessa tailors, the Russian Trade Association selling fur, Russian jewelry and silver at 58 Paris Street, and Vladimir's shop in Doğu Passage were the most well-known ones. But there were also Ferajal fashion house in Pera, owned by Natalia Nikolaevna Lazareva and her daughter, which served from 1920 to 23, and the fashion house Sidan, Russian fashion house, which was opened in 1920 by the Crimean Prince Toktamış Grey, served until 1960s. Also Corsac underwear and corsets, or Olga hats, served until late 1930s. Many aristocratic Russian women also wanted to work as tailors, but their tailoring experience was not a lot, and the style they choose, the elegant style they choose, was very plain for the Turkish Ottoman women who wanted to wear more decorative clothing. And also the bob hairstyle. We can talk about the bob hairstyle here, which was the short hairstyle of the 1920s. Russian refugees also brought this trend to Istanbul. Again, the flared skirts, the tassel attached to the skirt. Can you hear me? Is there any problem? Okay. The tassel attached to the skirt, the tulle vest, the belt that shrunk and knotted at the waist, the long embroidered velvet bolero, the flounces and sequins on the skirts, the use of frills on the collar, and fake mole fashion, which was very trendy in Europe, were also introduced by Russian women. Another interesting trend that Russian women brought to Istanbul women's life was the Rusbaşı, because as Timur has explained, not all Russian refugees were wealthy. Some of them were living in poverty and in filth. They got lice and they had to cut their hair at the roots, and they wrapped their heads with any piece of cloth they could find. And this headgear style called Rusbaşı became very popular among Muslim women as well, which exposed the nape, as you can see in the presentation. So also another development was sunbathing. Turkish people liked, for instance, coming to the Florya beach in Istanbul, which was changed its name to Florya with the Russian influence of the Russian accent. Its name now became Florya Beach. And at that time, Muslim women were not visiting the beaches. They had their sea baths, deniz banyosu called in Turkish. They were living in segregation, of course, but Russian women had no restrictions. So Turkish men came to Florya Beach to swim and, of course, to see beautiful Russian women, which was a competition for Turkish women. And as a result, in women's magazines, you can see new swimsuit models for swimming or sunbathing. They were featured more frequently as a result of this challenge. Another development was the creation of a national fashion, which I will explain later in much more detail, but this was very important because during the national struggle, national sentiments were very high, and therefore new national headgear models, yashmak, veil models, or new national çarşaf models were being introduced by the magazines of the time, women's periodicals. And at the same time, even national fashion competitions were held at the press of the time. But the most important thing about the occupation and war years is that women had to work outside because they had economic needs, and their men, most of their men had died in war, or they were still serving for the Ottoman army or the army for the national struggle. Many of them got widowed, and they were working outside. So their clothes had changed a lot. As you can see in this picture, some women, some garbage collectors were even wearing trousers to do their occupation, practice their profession. And therefore, the appearance of women got masculine, and many women cut their hair short, their skirts got shorter so they could move freely, and their clothes became wider. Less women used corsets, and they preferred more comfortable shoes now. But this development, which was featured also in the magazines, women's magazines, fashion magazines of the time, was not seen as a favorable development by the politicians of the time, because there were reactionary voices, especially the more conservative people who thought that even the military failures of the Ottoman army was a result of women's fashions and the development in women's lives. As women got freer, Ottoman army had more failures, etc. So politicians were very reluctant to give more concessions to women. For instance, during World War I in 1915, women working in government offices could discard their veil during work hours in the offices. But if their skirt length was shorter than what was allowed, police came to the office and sent them home. And also in 1917, notice was affixed to the walls in Istanbul by police. And in this notice, it was told that women should lengthen their skirts, should stop wearing corsets, and should thicken the fabric of their charshafs, which later was found that an old woman had forced the police to write such a notice and affix them to the wall, but this was the reaction of the society as well. And the fashion of short hair and especially pajamas were also discussed in fashion magazines. For instance, in the magazine Firuze, just after the occupation years in 1924, women were advised to wear pajamas, not only because this was something beautiful, but because it was fashionable. And it was told that women could make some modifications for not making it so masculine, could add some feminine details to their pajamas, and they should wear pajamas even if they don't like it, only because it was fashionable. So the trends are followed by a certain segment of the society who did not even question why this is fashionable. So this is something you can see as a development of that time, not only in Ottoman Empire, but also in other parts of the world. And also the short hair trend was very interesting. Some Asri modern women whose husbands allowed them to cut their hair could do this widely. There were many women who could cut their hair in the bob style, but there were also some women who did not want to argue with their men for cutting their hair. So as you can see in this presentation, there were women who were using fake short hair models. By not cutting their hair, they could simulate, use these techniques to show their hair shorter than it really was. Also, there were oppositional articles in women's magazines for women not to cut their hair. And many male writers, for instance, wanted to prevent women from short hair fashion. But we can say that this short hair fashion is not economically disadvantaged to hairdressers. It was also very expensive because for making the hair fluffier than it was, for making the short hair fluffier than it was, there was a process that hairdressers applied. And at the same time, they sold hairpins to decorate this short hair. So it was more advantageous for the hairdressers to cut women's hair short. So it's fashion economy at the same time, not only liberation of women, but at the same time, it was an economic development. And another important thing of the occupation years and war years was that women started university education in Istanbul. So you could see more stylish women students, female students on the street. And this was creating controversy as well. And some women's magazines especially discouraged young girls from using makeup, powder, corsets, or high heels. And some writers believe that female students had spent many hours in front of the mirror to do their hair and makeup or wear high heels or low-cut shirts, which was seen as a danger at that time because women were becoming looser morally, they told. In the 1920s, also the fashionable women called flapper in America and garçon in France, you could see salon women at that time, and these women were also being criticized by the writers of the time.
I'm sorry, but time is really over. We should leave some time for the discussion. So if you can really conclude, because I see you have still 8 slides, I don't think it's possible.
No, I can finish in 3 minutes if you allow. Is it possible?
Sorry?
If I have 3 minutes, I can finish all my presentation.
I think 1 minute should be.
Okay, then I will summarize what I will say in 1 minute. Okay.
Okay.
What we can say about this period then, there was the attempts to mimic the European fashions, but at the same time create the national fashion trend. So women also tried to shape their national headgear. For instance, the daughters of a Muslim tailor called Osman Zeki created their new national headgear models, and the magazines also presented women more sportier than they were ever, because as we all know, Russian women entered the city and they became a competition. So just like in Europe, Muslim women as well tried to do diet and follow certain sports, which was not the case before. And actually, during these occupation years, women changed their dress codes considerably, and they drew inspiration from European fashions, women of the occupying forces and Russian refugee women. But at the same time, nationalist intellectuals and desires created a national fashion, which was both modern but more economical, so they could spend less money for European fashions. And at the end of the armistice, bourgeois Turkish women were spending less time at home. They had less money and servants. They had to work outside. And even elite women saw that more women were working on the streets as small shopkeepers, civil servants, or even as street sweepers. So they were ready, more courage to make radical changes, not only in their clothing, but at the same time, in terms of their education and laws concerning them. All these developments contributed to the emergence of a new Turkish woman who was much more conscious of her rights and possibilities even before the Republic was proclaimed. However, many areas of struggle still remained in front of women, not only for reconsidering their fashion and appearance, but also for their liberation and empowerment. Thank you for listening to me.